and welcome to Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent. My guest today has been a Louisiana State Senator, college professor, and practicing lawyer. He served as mayor of New Orleans for 8 years and left office with a 70% approval rating. In 2013, Marc Morial was selected as president and CEO of the National Urban League, one of the nation's oldest and largest civil rights organizations. Mr. Morial, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be with you today. Good morning.
Good morning. It's really our pleasure. So I know that the National Urban League has quite a broad and expansive mission, and there are so many things that we're going to have a chance to talk about today. One of the things I think I want to just really start out with is I had a chance to listen to you on a panel not that long ago where you were discussing the intersection of workforce development and race. And in particular, you're talking a little bit about the role of community organizations and community-based providers, those that urban leagues across the country are working with, and their importance in the overall workforce development ecosystem. Can you, just for our listeners,
Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today, and certainly this conversation about jobs, workforce, and race is important. It's timely. What I hope people will understand is that in this nation, a quality job with a living wage or better is one of the essential elements of, I think, a free society and a society that affords economic opportunity to all. So we have to kind of start from the point that employment that pays well with benefits is a very important social objective, a very important political objective, a very important economic objective. And the National Urban League has squarely been in this work for now over 100 years. From our very beginning, we had a focus on jobs, we had a focus on economic opportunity, we had a focus on workforce development. Today, the economic disparities that exist in America are significant. And they're broad. And those economic disparities, one of the drivers of those disparities is race. What do I mean by that? Black and brown Americans, Latino Americans, and African Americans have a lower average income than do white Americans. African Americans have 1/10 of the wealth that white Americans have. So you start with the economic disparities, and that's where the racial imprint is. That's where the racial divide is, the racial dynamic is. It's because it's affected structurally the economy. Why does it operate that way? Well, barriers to employment over many, many years, barriers to certain types of jobs. In the city I grew up in, New Orleans, it was not until the 1970s that African Americans could even work as garbage collectors on the back of a garbage truck in New Orleans. It wasn't until the late 1960s that African Americans could become firefighters or police officers or work in jobs in city government above the broom and mop stick level. That's just about 50 years ago. The city of New Orleans just celebrated its 300th birthday. So think about that. For 250 of its 300 years, the only job an African American could hold in city government by law were jobs that were menial in nature, even if African Americans were more than qualified, more than available, more than willing, more than wanting to serve in those better jobs because of racial discrimination of those times. As time moved on, the doors did begin to open and began to open in police work, and fire work, and garbage collection work, and transit operator work, no doubt. But the higher jobs were still a longer time in attaining because of the after effect of that long period of discrimination and the fact that the opportunities in higher education, except that historically Black schools are mainly closed to African Americans until really the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s. So people have to understand that the structural nature of today's labor market has to be well understood by people. And people have to understand, in talking about the economy and talking about workforce, where we start. Now, the National Urban League is unique we are a national network of community-based organizations. So while we are known as a national civil rights, urban advocacy, and economic empowerment organization, we really function as a network of some 90 on-the-ground community-based organizations, whether it's the Chicago Urban League or the Urban League in Boston, or the Urban League in Columbus, Ohio, or St. Louis, or New Orleans, or Los Angeles, or Tallahassee, Florida, or Orlando. We are on the ground in these communities as a community-based provider. And for now, more than 100 years, we have been a provider of workforce development, job training, job connection, job preparation, job orientation services, assisting people in getting work and assisting people in preparing themselves for better work and assisting people in getting into places where historically African Americans did not have meaningful opportunities. I think what we've learned is that community colleges are important, four-year colleges are important, but community-based workforce providers are just as important. When you're talking about people who may not have finished high school, when you're talking about people who may have finished high school but didn't go on to post-secondary education, when you're talking about people who may have had an experience with the criminal justice system, community-based providers sometimes are far more effective, more culturally competent in helping people take that first step, in helping people get those first skills. And I think that a country and the funding community have to think better and think more about community-based providers as being as essential as a community college or as a four-year college to this entire discussion about post-secondary education, especially when it comes to dealing with the issues of race, when it comes to dealing with the issues of structural exclusion that exist in American society and in urban communities. And no doubt there are other community-based, and there are a handful of other national networks of community-based workforce providers, and not that many of us. There are many local, on-the-ground agencies that do great work, and we can do a lot more. We simply have to be recognized as being those people that, in many instances, prepare people to go to community college.
And so, as you're thinking about those, community organizations that are, often overlooked in this really important workforce development ecosystem, what are some of the challenges that you're hearing from your affiliates about either connecting those opportunities to the formal higher education system, community college, or four-year system, or just the proliferation of community-based providers themselves?
The most important issue is funding. So if you think about the post-secondary system, whether it's community colleges or four-year colleges, there's a financing system in place that assists people who cannot afford tuition to pay for that tuition. It's called the Pell Grant. It's called guaranteed student loans. It's called state-based scholarships. In the not-for-profit community-based provider community, there's nothing like that. We have to raise money from third parties and provide our services for free to the participants, or charge the participants, which is really not an option because we're dealing with people who come to us with significant financial and economic disadvantages. So the ecosystem of higher ed is set up so that there is a funding stream that's tied to the individual who can pay tuition at these schools, even if the tuition is supported by a federal Pell Grant, a state grant, a guaranteed student loan, a PLUS loan, whatever it may be. That kind of system doesn't exist in the community-based provider arena. So in community-based provider, we have to go and raise money from foundations, corporations, government grants, and then provide services. And that type of is spotty. It's inconsistent. It makes it difficult to plan because you're always recompeting grants every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. And it's not a sensible system if, in fact, helping people who may not be ready for community college, who may not want to go to community college, who may not be ready for four-year college, but want to improve their skills, want to get back in the workforce, for which community-based providers are the best option for them, is something that I think needs to be addressed in the next presidential administration, in the next Congress, because I don't think that there's the momentum or the interest in doing it now, but it's certainly on the agenda in the National Urban League going forward into the 21st century and into the 2020 election cycle.
So as we talk about, as you've pointed out, the kind of financing model that needs to happen, there's always the debate about where we're going to get the most amount of traction. Do we get the most amount of traction at that federal level, or are we going to get more traction at the state and local level, particularly as those states and regional level efforts are looking at new and innovative financing methods?
I think it's got to be both. I really think that both make sense, but I think that what we've learned is a national system that's supplemented by state and local and private is really the best way to put something together that has scale. If you think about the 4-year college system, it's supported by the feds. It's also supported by the states. Many of the institutions are state institutions or they are private institutions. We really have very few quote unquote federal colleges and universities. Maybe the military academies fall into that category. Maybe a legacy institution like Howard University may fall into sort of a federalized institution, something that the federal government, the Freedmen's Bureau finds. So I think the best thing in today's society is to think in terms of partnerships, is to think in terms of where the feds and the states and local governments can work together, can have a sharing of interests, a sharing of resources in order to do this sort of thing. The economy by design, more than ever before, is a national economy. There are regional economies and then local economies, but the overall economic conditions, and I believe that it is of paramount importance to the nation's national security, the nation's economic competitiveness, the nation's economic opportunity and racial dynamic, that we put a renewed focus on those who've historically been locked out and left out to help them. So, and our work is not just for people who are unemployed. Our work is for that person who may be out there with a job and says, you know what, I want to do more. I want a better job. And they face the reality, look, I need some additional skills. I need to move into a program that is going to assist me. And I need an opportunity that I can pursue while at the same time I'm holding on to a job. Community-based providers many times provide that option across the nation. And I really feel very strongly that a blended approach with community-based providers, community colleges, and 4-year colleges are great. I just visited our reentry program in New Orleans a couple of months ago. I met a really, really impressive woman who is now on the way through our program. She enrolled in a 4-year university. She is about to complete that course of study and get a bachelor's degree. So we also bridge people, pathway people, build ladders for people to go to community college or 4-year college when they may not be ready at inception.
And so, related to that, I mean, when you think about the ability to be prosperous, and as you said, even if you're not currently unemployed, those who are wanting a better job or to continue to skill up, you've talked about the new lifelong learning model that's coming out. Our president and Lumina has been very focused on this as well. That the old system of learning then work is out the door, and it's much more intertwined now. Who do you think is most vulnerable to being left behind in the kind of future of work and learning?
Vulnerable communities. I think people of color. I think people that only have a high school diploma or less are much more likely to be left behind. And here's why. One of the things I've noticed by looking at the private sector in America, the private sector does really well in investing in the enhanced capabilities, in the learning, in the professional development of its executives. It's mid-level executives, it's executives and above. They don't have the same type of commitment to what I would call their line employees. Now, there are probably some exceptions out there. Those folks can get left behind. They can get left behind. It's mothers raising children, It's someone who is 31, 32, 33 years old and may not have been to college, but has worked their way and sort of had the same job with without much upward mobility for several years. And so what we want is an economy that allows people to move up. It's great to have a job, but you don't want to have the same job at 35 that you had at 25. And you certainly don't want to have the same job at 45 as you had at 25, unless you've been afforded raises and promotions and an opportunity to move up. If you're talking about what's optimal in the economy, it's the ability for people to move up. That's why the lifelong learning model is so important. And I think it requires a cultural adjustment. I think that's why community-based providers can be very effective. Early in my career, I had an opportunity to teach at Xavier University. I was an adjunct professor, and I also did some teaching at Southern University in New Orleans, which in effect is a school that provides most of its students attend class at night or on weekends. We need more opportunities when it comes to learning, for learning to be able to be carried out on a flexible schedule. Now, most people say, well, we can go to online. I think online can be extremely beneficial and helpful, but I still believe there's nothing like having learning experiences face to face in a classroom with peers with dynamic interaction. And some of that can be done online, but not in the same way. So hybridization, where there's some online learning and there's some in-person learning. We've got to rethink the model that exists to move to a lifelong learning model. And we've got to rethink the providers, right? Colleges and universities, you see many colleges and universities creating executive education, creating institutes, creating methods and ways to participate in this lifelong learning space. And that's positive, but we need to enhance the ability of community-based providers, because it's the community-based providers that can provide services to the most vulnerable people, to the single moms, to people who may have been in the criminal justice system, to people who don't have adequate transportation, but don't have the ability to go cross town, or people who may not have a strong, continuous, free data internet connection plan. And therefore using the internet is great, but some homes have one computer, and maybe the daughter's got to do her homework, the son's got to do his homework, and having one computer in the home, sometimes it's difficult for people to be able to use it for lifelong learning. So we've got to rethink this whole thing, and I think it's one of those things where it needs involvement of the nonprofit community and the foundation community, like you guys, those of us who are community-based leaders and community-based providers who understand equity. Who understand equity requires us to do things differently and think things differently, and not just continue with the same old model. And it requires the advocacy and support of elected officials. This is important. People say, where will we find the money? Well, we found money for a very expensive tax cut. We put $60 billion more into the military. It's a question of what are our priorities. And I think if we're going to compete, if we're going to stay strong, if we're going to address the future of this country with China and India and other countries really, really rising, we've got to do what America's always done, and that is invest in its strongest asset. That's its people. That's its human capital. That's our ability. If we are well educated and well prepared to compete with anyone.
You know, you've addressed what we need to be doing on the government side, on the social side, but where do you see the private sector fitting into this new ecosystem to support the kind of model you're talking about?
An enlightened private sector. I think the major corporations, major companies that have resources do focus a little bit on this. I think they've got to focus on it more for their frontline employees, not just their executives. I think that ability to really move up. I mean, one company that's always impressive to me is a company like UPS, because every chief executive officer at UPS once worked on a truck or worked in a plant. They've managed to do something that was common in corporate America that very few are able to do, and that is to move people from the first level job in their company all the way up the ladder to the top job. And that's impressive. And I'm not suggesting that other companies have to do that or should do that, but I think people should look at what UPS does as a company, because obviously embedded into that is lifelong learning, the ability of people to gain skills on all along the way that qualifies them to move from what essentially are blue collar jobs up to white collar jobs. We need leadership from the business community. We need advocacy from the business community, and we need a bargain where the business community says we're going to commit to this, but we'd like government to commit to that. It's not just about hiring the next scientist or the next engineer. That's important. This is also about the real people, the invisible people, the silent majority of people, the hardworking men and women. I see them all the time who make things work. And increasingly, they are Black, they are brown, they're immigrants, they're people of color, they're young people. Increasingly, this workforce, and therefore you got to meet them where they are. That's where community-based providers come in. That's where local government comes in. Meet them where they are.
And so going back to where we began, which was a discussion of the history of structural racism and, of course, our current state of structural racism, what do you think that we need to be doing as a nation to address structural racism as it pertains to kind of workforce development?
The starting point is for people to sort of take a step back and open their mind to learn about structural racism. Look, we have to have a starting point. We're not celebrating, we're noting 1619, the beginning of slavery in America, 400 years later. 1619, 400 years. Well, for 350 of those 400 years, African Americans were either enslaved in this country or operating in an environment where there was legal segregation and discriminatory laws on the books. So you only had 50 years of 400 where the playing field has begun the process to be level. People have to understand, number one, what structural racism is. They also have to understand, and there's a brand new study out by McKinsey that talks about the negative effect of structural racism in the workforce on GDP, on economic output, on the overall economy, because what you're doing with structural racism is you're basically keeping people who have talent in a situation where they underperform in the economy. They're held back, their talents are not left to full use. So we need to understand it is number one. Number two, I think we need to listen to people like the National Urban League and those that have long experiences in devising effective solutions, effective interventions, effective programs to try to address this sort of intersection of workforce and race. And I'll give you an interesting idea, an interesting concept that we've gotten away from in America. I mean, for 30 years, the federal government had a standalone summer youth employment program. We utilized it when I was mayor of New Orleans. We put 4,000 or 5,000 kids to work every summer. That program afforded 15, 16, 17, and 18-year-olds an opportunity not only to work at a Popeyes or a McDonald's or at a Stop and Shop or at a CVS, but an opportunity to work in an office in city government, in a law office, in a business office for career exploration, to expose young people. That's another way to sort of begin the process of dealing with structural racism so that young people in a Black community, in a brown community, in an urban community, or even kids that are in rural areas, right, have an opportunity to be exposed to jobs, careers, business environments that they would otherwise not have any exposure to. Whet their appetite, get them excited, expose them to careers and opportunities to see if that's what they want to use, that's how they want to develop and utilize their talent. So there are any range of things. And I think we have to understand it, and we've got to get to the strategies and interventions to address it. I think the good news is The better news is that there's a much greater appetite amongst many in the country today to have a discussion of racism. The bad news is that in the political square in America, the issue of race is being weaponized for political purposes. So you've got to kind of got two things, if you will, clashing in the public square, which is on one side an intelligent conversation about race and America and our future, and on the other side, an effort to weaponize it and make it a political tool for election processes, election purposes.
Well, Mr. Morial, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Really appreciate you coming on, and I'll let you get back to your busy day.
Hey, thank you. We'll see you soon.
Have a good one. Recently, I sat down with Dr. Jasmine Haywood to talk about Lumina's partners and how they're operationalizing racial equity. Let's listen in. Hey, Jasmine, thanks for being with us today. So, yeah, of course. I know we've been talking about getting you in, and I thought this would be a really great topic for us to discuss today. Yeah. So just to start us out, and for those who might not follow Lumina's every single movement and breath, can you talk a little bit about when Lumina or we are talking about equity, what we actually mean?
Yeah. So Lumina Foundation has what we call an equity imperative, which is essentially our statement that describes our commitment to racial justice and equity. And we specifically focus on racial equity for the Black population, the Latino population, and the American Indian or Native populations. And then also some subpopulations of Asian students. So that is our equity imperative, and it really came about because we found that in our work and with our grantees, we need to explicitly name race and ethnicity to get the outcomes of the work that we want. And when we weren't doing that, we weren't seeing the systemic change that we needed to see.
I mean, I know that's something that you and I, we just recently gave a presentation around this about things like, partners who might use low income as a proxy for race or, more race neutral kinds of policies and practices, which I know we'll get into. So, but thank you a little bit for clarifying a little bit about what we mean by equity, because I have a friend who's a realtor, and every time I start talking about equity, he assumes I'm talking about home equity. And so,
right.
Just for the record, folks, we're talking about racial equity here.
Yes.
So, Jasmine, I think one of the topics that we've been having a lot of conversations about inside at Lumina, and one of the, I would say, largest or most frequently requested pieces of support we get from partners or grantees or other foundations or researchers is we can talk about equity, we can define racial equity, we can even spot inequitable practices and policies, but how do we, and we've landed on this word, operationalize equity, which is even kind of a clunky thing to begin with. And so I wanted to just spend some time talking to you today about what are we learning and talking about when it comes to operationalizing equity. What advice are we giving out to the field? I mean, it's a fairly complicated question in a way about how does one, once you're armed with information, do something about that?
Yeah. Well, so it is contextual based on where you sit within the field of post-secondary education in terms of sector and level, but I think there's a few overarching ways that equity can be operationalized. So one of them might be analyzing data disaggregated by race and ethnicity, and what that does is allow you to look at disparities and inequities. To then be able to pinpoint how to address them. So then another way to operationalize equity might be to look at systemic root causes of problems. So instead of approaching something by looking at a surface level solution to a systemic problem, you need to go for the root cause. of that particular problem. And then the last way I'll mention is really just naming race, ethnicity, racism explicitly. It's really difficult and impossible to operationalize equity if you have not taken the time to cultivate a space where you can name that explicitly, and that's really important for the work. I think what we see with a lot of our grantees is that they don't have as hard a time getting buy-in or getting a commitment to operationalize equity. It's after they do that first step where they get stuck and they're not sure, now what do I do to address this overwhelming inequity that exists in my institution, for example. And so I think those are some strategies that, organizations can use.
Can you think of some examples maybe of some partners or institutions that have been able to get to that next step? I know for me with a lot of my grantees and partners at Lumina, they do have the data. They've done some analysis. I think the root cause piece is particularly interesting because they'll say, well, root cause poverty. And it becomes such a massive, intractable challenge that it almost is a way cognitively to explain it away, even though that's not their intention. But I know that's not what you're saying either, that there's probably some root causes prior to just relegating it off to an intractable problem. And there's even some places that I think do a pretty good job about naming race and having conversations about race and racism. But then when they say, but when we're still looking at our outcomes, they are still disproportionately racialized, right? And can you give me some examples, or can you think of some examples of some folks who have really taken on to the next step?
Yeah, so the one that's top of mind for me is in our Adult Promise body of work, one of our states that is part of our second cohort is Oklahoma. And Oklahoma has chosen to focus on the American Indian and Native population, adult population in their state. And some of the things that they're doing to operationalize equity and outreach to the American Indian population, I think are exemplars for other people looking to do this work. So, for example, they have sessions in the communities where they go out to the community where American Indian and Native folks live, and they have essentially they're like admissions sessions where they talk about how to navigate coming back to college or starting college if you're an adult with no degree. And for these particular sessions, I think what really the example where they've really operationalized equity is where they have people from that population leading the sessions, so people that identify as American Indian or Native, which is important for those in that community. And then they also offer childcare during these sessions. And so we know for adult students, for today's students, one of the big challenges is that they are pulled in a lot of different ways in terms of work and childcare. And so they took that step to eliminate that barrier, to allow them to be able to receive the information about going back to college. So I think that's one example that's top of mind for me.
Well, and I think it touches on the one of the most important things that I know I look for in like a lot of my work, which is are you doing with or are you doing to?
Right.
I think as I were adding to the list of ways to help operationalize equity, data analysis, root cause, naming race and racism. One of the things that we've talked about a lot is representation. And how many times do we get grant proposals or other concept papers and things from partners that say, "Hey, we want to do this for Latinos," but when we look at the staff, when we look at the leadership, when we look at the folks who have designed, say, a program, policy, or intervention, 0% are Latino.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges I see a lot of times is people in the field will let the intervention drive the work instead of letting the problem drive the work. And that often happens when you don't bring communities of color to the table and get their feedback on what it is they think they need and what their solutions might be. Another really great example is Colorado, one of our talent, innovation, and equity states. They have created equity champions essentially within the state by reaching out to communities of color and bringing them to the table to state policy conversations and, like you said, working with them. And not imposing a solution on a community of color that they had no input or say in.
Yeah, Dayton, Ohio, and the region around that has done something similar. They've gone into community centers and schools and a variety of other institutions and, provided a little bit of training and equipment, but, equipped people who are already there, people who are trusted members of the community, to be able to connect to resources and support, and I think they call them equity champions as well. And so, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of good examples out there about how to meaningfully include folks. So far, I think if I'm listening and I put on my old hat before I worked at Lumina and I was someone who was trying to do this work, I understand that I need some good data and I need to analyze that data and make sure it's disaggregated. I am still shocked at how many institutions do not report disaggregated data, especially to national data sets. So quick plug for anyone listening out there, go do that and check. Just because you're doing it to iPads and other places doesn't mean you're doing it universally. We've talked about some root cause analysis work, naming race and racism, representation. I think it also can be an overwhelming topic to saying, like, how do I operationalize equity? Part of me wonders to what degree is it just simply a numbers kind of game at some point. I remember listening to Sam Sanders from NPR, and he was doing an interview, and then someone asked him, like, well, how do you make sure that you have diverse voices on your show? And he said, it's literally a numbers game. We have an Excel spreadsheet that just says men, women, and then breaks down by race, ethnicity, and we just keep track. And he's like, and as long as our numbers are there. And, I guess I'm curious from your perspective too, in terms of outcomes, in terms of just, actual outputs, how much of operationalizing equity needs to be a numbers game? And is that a step past naming and having conversations and data that we expect people to get to?
So I think it's a necessary step because there's power in numbers. But I would hesitate to give that advice in isolation because what can happen is then, let's say we're talking about a higher ed institution, if they make it a numbers game, then they increase their faculty and staff of color, for example. And then, those people become kind of like window dressings. It becomes that's diversity, it's not equity. So while diversity and representation is important, I think the more deeper systemic approach is being sure that people of color have power and voice, being sure that they even approach things with a racial equity lens. It is not a given that just because you are a person of color, or identify as a person of color, that you have a very strong, critical lens or racial equity lens in your work. And so I think that approach of numbers and diversity and representation needs to be paired with racial equity, racial justice, and being sure that you're engaging people of color, communities of color in a deep and an authentic way.
So for someone who's listening and is probably eager for some resources, do you have places that people can go to for good information or other tools and things like that to help them think through this?
Yes, there are a lot of really great, free, publicly available tools that I think people can use. So I'll just name a couple. A most recent one that came out was a report titled "Why Am I Being Researched?" It was put together by an organization called Chicago Beyond.
They were just on the show.
There we go. Yeah. So, and I really like that piece because they've targeted it towards different audiences. So there's a section in there for funders, there's a section in there for researchers, and there's a section in there for those from the community. So they get down to very tangible advice as to the questions to ask and how to approach work. So those that engage in a lot of research, I think that would be a great research, particularly with communities of color, that would be a great tool. Grantcraft also has a report called Grant Making with a Racial Equity Lens. That's been really helpful for me in my work, and I know others at Lumina Foundation. Race Forward is another really great go-to that I use a lot. They have a lot of tools on their site. One of my favorite tools that we actually discussed yesterday in our office is called the Racial Equity Impact Assessment. And what that is a guide that provides questions to ask to assess the extent to which your work is being done through a racial equity lens. So that's a very concrete tool that lots of folks can use. And then the last one I'll mention is a website called racialequitytools.org. And they also have just a variety of tools for different organizations to use. My two favorite sections on that website would be the communications section, so communicating with racial equity language through a racial equity lens. And then they also have some really great evaluation tools and resources for those that do that work.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for coming on today and chatting with us about this. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to Marc Morial and the staff at the National Urban League. My thanks to Dr. Jasmine Haywood for joining me today, and thank you for listening. If you have a comment or an idea for a future show, reach us at luminafoundation.org or reach me on Twitter at Dakota Plicki. See you next time.